The matter that constituted articulation of necessity regarding the alliance between the Ashington family and the Duke of Ravensfield had emerged from circumstances of such profound financial complexity as to render impossible the continuation of the Ashington household without undertaking of arrangement that possessed capacity to transform the very foundations of their diminished circumstances. The financial situation that had resulted from the death of Lord Ashington 5 years previously, combined with the systematic mismanagement undertaken by his younger brother, who had undertaken stewardship of estates, had generated consequence of such magnitude as to render the future of the Ashington daughters matters of considerable institutional and social concern. Yet the arrangement that had been negotiated between Lady Ashington, widow 56 years, bearing the weight of maternal responsibility for unmarried daughters, and the Duke of Ravensfield constituted articulation of such remarkable particularity as to render visible the complexity of circumstance and the desperation of situation. The Duke, in his capacity as most eligible and most formidable bachelor within the county, had articulated through his solicitors certain conditions regarding what form any matrimonial arrangement might constitute. He required alliance with family of respectable lineage. He required substantial financial settlement, demonstrating good faith, and he had articulated with particular specificity his absolute preference for young women of gentle, amenable temperament who would undertake to manage his household with efficiency whilst maintaining appropriate distance from his private consciousness and his personal quarters. Such specification, for gentle, amenable temperament, for efficiency without presumption, for presence without demanding engagement, had constituted articulation that rendered immediately apparent to Lady Ashington the identity of which daughter was most appropriately suited to fulfillment of such requirements. Margaret, the younger daughter, 24 years, possessed of conventional beauty and charming superficiality, possessed temperament more suited to cultivation of admirers and to undertaking of social performance. Violet, the elder daughter, 28 years, unmarried despite advantages of family connections, possessed of quiet competence and unremarkable appearance, constituted individual whose very invisibility within society qualified her for the Duke's specific requirements. The irony that constituted the most profound dimension of this arrangement, the irony that would generate all consequence that would follow, constituted irony that Lady Ashington perceived with remarkable clarity even as she articulated decision to send Violet rather than Margaret. The Duke desired absence of demand, absence of intrusion into his carefully maintained solitude. He desired woman who would constitute presence without constituting threat. And in his systematic articulation of what he perceived as his requirements, what he perceived as rational specification for matrimonial arrangement predicated upon mutual convenience rather than mutual engagement, the Duke had articulated precisely the conditions that would render impossible his defense against what Violet Ashington might actually constitute. Violet received communication of her designation for this arrangement, with response characterized by such profound absence of surprise as to render visible the manner in which she had long since internalized her own expendability within family consciousness. She had, across the years following her father's death and her family's financial decline, undertaken systematic performance of invisibility so complete that the suggestion that she should undertake marriage, undertaken not for any perceived charm or advantage she might constitute, but rather undertaken because her absence from the household would render available resources for Margaret's presentation during the social season, constituted articulation that aligned precisely with her own understanding of her position and her value. "I shall undertake to fulfill whatever responsibilities such arrangement requires," Violet articulated to her mother, voice communicating neither enthusiasm nor resistance, but rather simple acceptance of duty. "I understand that the Duke requires efficient management of his household and discretion regarding his personal affairs. Such requirements constitute matters within my capacity to accommodate. The journey from the reduced Ashington estate to Ravensfield Manor, undertaken across late autumn landscape, through grey rain and leaden skies that seemed to communicate atmospheric alignment with the emotional tone of the arrangement, constituted passage that permitted Violet considerable opportunity for contemplation of what her new existence might constitute. She had undertaken to read with meticulous care various published accounts of the Duke of Ravensfield, his extraordinary authority, his systematic distance from social engagement, his reputation for absolute control and absolute refusal of emotional complication within his personal or professional relationships. What emerged from such reading constituted articulation of such remarkable clarity regarding what her situation actually required, clarity communicating that her appointed position required not love, not romantic engagement, but rather systematic undertaking of household management, with such competence and such unwillingness to demand personal attention that the Duke might, over time, render her as invisible within his household as she had rendered herself within broader society. The arrival at Ravensfield Manor itself constituted a moment of such architectural and atmospheric significance as to render visible the nature of the institution into which Violet was undertaking to enter. The manor, vast grey stone structure rising from moorlands, windows like observant eyes, architecture communicating centuries of accumulated power and authority, communicated through its very form the manner in which the Duke had constructed his life as fortress against unwanted intrusion and unwanted emotional engagement. The reception undertaken by household staff constituted articulation of courtesy that possessed quality of systematic distance. Housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, no relation to Violet, the coincidence of surnames rendering no commentary, demonstrated competent professionalism regarding orientation to household management and household expectations. The staff itself observed the arrival of the new Duchess with expressions that communicated neither enthusiasm nor opposition, but rather professional neutrality regarding change in household composition. It was in the formal drawing room, during moment of formal presentation undertaken as final preparation, before Violet's official introduction to the Duke himself, that Sir William Thornton, guest of the Duke, occupying position of closest associate and something approaching genuine friend, undertook to observe Violet with attention that constituted remarkable departure from the systematic invisibility she had experienced throughout her journey. His examination of her person, her clothing, her bearing, communicated quality of observation, extending far beyond ordinary courtesy. "I articulate," Sir William said, voice communicating something approaching gentle warmth, "that you possess quality of remarkable stillness, Miss Ashington. It constitutes unusual characteristic in individual undertaking to assume position of considerable responsibility within unfamiliar household." Violet perceived in Sir William's articulation and in the manner of his observation recognition of dimension of her existence that few individuals had ever articulated or acknowledged. His comment constituted not compliment in conventional sense. He had articulated no praise regarding beauty or charm, but rather articulation that communicated recognition of her essential character, her capacity for stillness, for observation, for presence without demand. The Duke himself constituted a phenomenon of such extraordinary impact as to render difficult the systematic rationalization that Violet had undertaken to construct regarding what her new existence might require. When he entered the drawing-room, having delayed his entrance with apparent deliberation, the atmosphere itself seemed to undergo transformation, air becoming colder, space contracting, all attention automatically orienting toward his presence. The storm-grey eyes that constituted such significant dimension of his reputation possessed in actual encounter quality of such intensity as to render nearly physical the manner in which his gaze could penetrate consciousness and render visible all that he undertook to observe. His acknowledgment of Violet constituted articulation of such perfect civility as to render nearly visible the systematic distance he maintained from all individuals within his proximity. He articulated words that constituted conventional welcome, acknowledgement that the household would endeavor to provide what comfort could be offered, expectation that the Duchess would undertake management of household affairs with efficiency, hope that the arrangement would prove satisfactory to all parties involved. Yet the tone that accompanied such articulation, the manner in which he spoke without truly observing her, the evident consciousness that he was undertaking to fulfill obligation rather than to engage in genuine encounter, communicated with absolute clarity the nature of the relationship that he anticipated would characterize their matrimonial arrangement. The weeks that extended from Violet's arrival at Ravensfield Manor into the deepening winter constituted period during which she undertook to render herself so completely integrated into the functioning of the household as to achieve quality of invisibility that transcended even what she had previously accomplished within her family's diminished estate. She understood, with clarity approaching absolute, the precise nature of the arrangement that the Duke anticipated. She was to constitute presence without constituting demand. She was to manage household affairs with such competence that nothing requiring his attention or involvement would ever require communication regarding her own necessity or her own existence. And so Violet undertook, with systematic deliberation and with consciousness of the degree to which her happiness and her security depended upon her undertaking to fulfill such role with absolute precision, to render herself essential through means that would never require acknowledgement of her person or personality. She reconstructed household management systems that had fallen into disarray during period of the Duke's previous governance, through hired administrators of limited capacity. She undertook to engage with staff in manner that communicated respect and understanding rather than demanding obedience. She restored gardens to condition of respectable cultivation without calling attention to the manner in which such cultivation was being accomplished. Yet the most significant dimension of her systematic invisibility constituted her undertaking to maintain such complete separation from the Duke's private existence and consciousness as to constitute, in effect, parallel life within shared household. She regulated her movements through the manor, such that her presence within corridors and chambers would not constitute intrusion upon his movements. She attended meals in manner that permitted her to undertake management of household matters without requiring his engagement in conversation or interaction. She arranged household schedule such that her hours of activity would rarely intersect with his own hours, rendering the household as close to maintaining the solitary existence he appeared to value as was possible when it required the presence of one additional individual. The Duke's response to such systematic arrangement constituted articulation of such approval as to render visible his satisfaction with the arrangement he had negotiated. He articulated, in communications to his solicitors regarding management of marriage settlement and regarding household finances, appreciation for the manner in which the Duchess was undertaking her responsibilities with such efficiency as to permit him to undertake his obligations regarding estate management without distraction or complication. The household staff, observing the manner in which Violet undertook her role, responded with something approaching respect, recognizing that she constituted individual of genuine competence and genuine understanding of what household management actually required. Yet there existed, within Violet's systematic performance of invisible presence, articulation of dimension that constituted articulation extending far beyond what could be articulated as merely mechanical fulfillment of responsibilities. Within the household management that she undertook, within the manner in which she engaged with staff, and with the systematic operations of the manor, there emerged evidence of something that constituted something approaching grace, not grace as articulated through surface charm or through deliberate performance, but grace as emerged through genuine understanding of what care and what attention to human flourishing might actually require. It was during the occasion of the Duke's hosting of significant gathering, political event attended by individuals of considerable importance and consequence, that the first evidence emerged of the manner in which Violet's systematic presence, precisely because it had been maintained with such consistency and such absence of demand for recognition, was beginning to generate consequence in dimensions that neither she nor the Duke had anticipated. The evening had been orchestrated with such systematic perfection, household arrangements, dining, entertainment, political discussion, that the guests departed with articulation of such complete satisfaction as to constitute remarkable credit to the household management that had undergone such transformation since the Duke's marriage. And it was Sir William Thornton, observing the manner in which the evening had unfolded, and perceiving with remarkable clarity the manner in which Violet had rendered it possible through her presence, without permitting her presence to become visible, who undertook to communicate certain observations to the Duke following the departure of guests. "I articulate to you," Sir William said, voice communicating tone of such gentle clarity as to constitute nearly indirect rebuke, that the evening proceeded with such remarkable smoothness as to constitute evidence of management of extraordinary sophistication. "I articulate further that I perceive your Duchess constitutes individual of such considerable capacity and such genuine understanding of what household stewardship might require as to render questionable whether you have undertaken, as yet, to truly observe the individual who has undertaken to accomplish such transformation." The Duke's response constituted articulation of such characteristic distance as to render visible his inclination to decline engagement, with implication that Sir William's observation contained. I articulate that the Duchess has undertaken to fulfill her responsibilities with such efficiency as to permit me to undertake my own obligations without distraction, the Duke responded, voice communicating tone of absolute finality. I articulate further that such fulfillment of responsibility constitutes precisely the arrangement that I had articulated as my requirement. I perceive no necessity for any additional dimension of engagement or observation. Yet despite the Duke's articulation of such complete satisfaction, and despite his apparent intention to undertake continuation of arrangement as previously established, there had commenced, within the manor itself, subtle process of transformation, process that had been initiated, not through any deliberate intention or action on Violet's part, but rather through the systematic manifestation of grace and of genuine care that constituted the essential nature of her character, and that could not be completely concealed even through such systematic undertaking to render herself invisible. The winter months that extended toward their completion constituted period during which the Duke undertook to perceive, with increasing frequency and with increasing discomfort at the perception itself, manifestations of Violet's presence that constituted articulation of such remarkable character as to render impossible his previous systematic ability to render her invisible within his own consciousness. The first such manifestation emerged through articulation of household staff. Servants who had previously undertaken their duties with mechanical compliance had begun to undertake their work with something approaching genuine engagement, engaging with work not as obligation, but as undertaking in which competence and care constituted matters of personal significance. The Duke perceived this transformation, but undertook to attribute it to systematic improvement in household organization, rather than to attribute it to any dimension of Violet's personal influence upon those within her sphere of authority. Yet there emerged, during period of deepening winter and approaching isolation of the manor through snowfall and circumstance, revelation of such character as to render impossible continued systematic denial of what Violet had actually undertaken to accomplish within the household and within the consciousness of all those residing within it. The revelation emerged through event that constituted articulation of significant personal crisis. The head groom, elderly individual of considerable institutional knowledge regarding the Duke's stables and animals, suffered sudden and severe illness during period of extreme cold, when the household was most isolated from possibility of summoning medical assistance from neighboring estates. The man lay in conditions of considerable suffering, fever rendering him delirious, prognosis constituting articulation that without intervention, his survival constituted matter of considerable uncertainty. It was during this crisis that the Duke perceived through process of systematic observation, undertaken in moments when he undertook to assess the situation, the manner in which Violet had undertaken to manage the situation with such systematic care and such evident determination to render the groom's suffering less than it might have been. She undertook to maintain vigil at his bedside during hours when the household had undertaken to rest. She had undertaken to communicate with staff regarding maintenance of warmth, regarding hydration, regarding all the systematic mechanisms through which human suffering might be alleviated. She had undertaken, additionally, to communicate directly with the Duke regarding the groom's condition and regarding the various interventions she was undertaking, not with articulation that constituted appeal for approval or for appreciation, but rather with simple direct communication of what the situation required and what she was undertaking to accomplish. The Duke perceived in her communication absence of any appeal for gratitude or for recognition, merely articulation of responsibility undertaken because responsibility was indicated by circumstance and by human need. When, after 4 days and nights of her systematic care, the groom's fever broke and his recovery became apparent, Violet undertook to share the news with the Duke, not as articulation of personal accomplishment, but merely as articulation of fact that might be of interest to him regarding the status of the household. She did not articulate expectation of praise or acknowledgement. She simply communicated fact, undertook to return to her other responsibilities, and permitted the matter to conclude without further articulation of personal involvement or personal investment. Yet the Duke perceived in the aftermath of this revelation manifestation of understanding regarding who Violet actually constituted, understanding that he had been systematically undertaking to avoid through process of maintenance of distance and through process of rendering her invisible within his consciousness. He began to perceive within the manor evidence of her presence in dimensions he had not previously permitted himself to acknowledge. The manner in which common rooms had been arranged to facilitate genuine comfort for staff. The manner in which household finances had been managed to permit wages that constituted not merely adequate compensation, but fair recognition of genuine work undertaken. The manner in which households seemed to constitute, under her stewardship, institution in which individuals were perceived as individuals rather than as mechanisms for accomplishment of tasks. It was Sir William Thornton who, observing the manner in which the Duke's perception had begun to shift, undertook to communicate certain articulations of such directness as to constitute nearly confrontation. "I articulate to you," Sir William said during one evening conversation, voice communicating tone of such genuine concern as to constitute articulation, extending beyond mere friendship, that you are undertaking to engage in process of perceiving your own wife as individual of genuine worth and of genuine capacity for what might constitute authentic human engagement. I articulate further that such perception, once commenced, will require from you undertaking of such fundamental transformation in your own understanding of what relationship and what genuine human connection might require as to constitute matter of such difficulty as will challenge the very structures through which you have constructed your consciousness. The Duke's response constituted articulation of such rare vulnerability as to render visible the manner in which he was undertaking, with considerable resistance, to permit perception that he had systematically attempted to avoid. "I articulate," the Duke said, voice communicating emotion of such weight as to constitute nearly articulation of despair, that the arrangement that I negotiated and that I believed I required constituted arrangement predicated upon my desire to maintain absolute control over my consciousness and absolute maintenance of distance from any individual who might require from me what I perceive myself as incapable of providing. I articulate that such desire emerged from circumstance and from experience that rendered me perceive love itself as constituting danger and constituting threat to the very structures through which I have constructed my existence. I articulate that I am uncertain whether perception of your observations constitutes recognition of truth or constitutes commencement of process that will render my very existence incomprehensible and intolerable to me. The revelation of what Violet had actually constituted within the household, the recognition that could no longer be systematically denied or maintained at distance through process of deliberate invisibility, generated within the Duke consciousness of such complexity and such troubling character as to render questionable his very capacity to undertake governance of his own thoughts and his own emotional responses. The man who had constructed himself as individual entirely capable of systematic control and absolute maintenance of emotional distance found himself undertaking to experience emotional responses that threatened the very foundations of such construction. Yet there emerged, during this period of internal complication and of systematic disturbance to the equilibrium that he had maintained with such care and such apparent completeness, articulation of circumstance that would render impossible any continued avoidance of what his perception of Violet had actually constituted, and what such perception might require from him in terms of fundamental transformation of consciousness and understanding. The circumstance emerged through vehicle of guest arriving at the manor, guest who constituted individual of such particular character and such evident history of prior connection to the Duke as to generate atmosphere within the household that rendered visible the nature of what the Duke's previous existence had constituted and what his attempted reconstruction of himself through maintenance of emotional distance had actually signified. The guest who arrived during period of late winter, when snow had been replaced by grey rain and landscape, had assumed quality of bleakness communicating absence of hope, constituted individual identified as Lord Marcus Hawthorne, individual of the Duke's own age, of similar aristocratic standing, but of quite different temperament and quite different approach to what authority and what personal existence might require. Lord Hawthorne had, across the preceding years, undertaken to live life characterized by engagement with emotional and personal dimensions of existence. He had married for love rather than for convenience, had undertaken to engage with his own children with genuine attention and personal involvement, had constructed life predicated not upon systematic control, but upon systematic engagement with what authentic human connection might actually require. The reunion between the Duke and Lord Hawthorne constituted articulation of such emotional complexity as to render visible the history of friendship that existed between the two individuals and the manner in which their divergent paths had generated distances between them that were not merely geographical but fundamental. Yet the observation that Lord Hawthorne undertook regarding the Duke's marriage and regarding the Duke's current state of consciousness, observation communicated through remarks that constituted mixture of genuine concern and gentle irony, constituted articulation that rendered unavoidable the Duke's confrontation with the reality of what his own existence had actually become. "I articulate," Lord Hawthorne said, regarding the Duke with expression communicating such mixture of affection and concern as to constitute nearly appeal, "that you have constructed existence for yourself that constitutes existence of such remarkable isolation and such systematic distance from what genuine human experience might actually require as to render questionable whether the control you believe yourself to maintain constitutes control or constitutes rather articulation of systematic captivity that you have imposed upon your own consciousness. I articulate further," Lord Hawthorne continued, "that I perceive within your household an individual, your wife, the Duchess, who constitutes individual of such genuine grace and such authentic human kindness as to possess capacity to render possible the transformation that your consciousness requires. I articulate that I perceive you are undertaking to resist such transformation with every mechanism of defense and every systematic construction of distance that you have available to you. I articulate that I perceive such resistance itself constitutes greatest tragedy, for the person it endangers and harms most profoundly constitutes you yourself." The observation, communicated with such evident concern and with such undeniable truth as to render impossible its dismissal, generated within the Duke consciousness of emotional response so intense as to constitute nearly physical experience of pain. He perceived, through Lord Hawthorne's articulation and through his own simultaneous observation of his own wife, Violet engaged in conversation with Lord Hawthorne's wife, woman of remarkable warmth and genuine kindness, demonstrating in her bearing and in her responses evidence of such capacity for authentic human engagement as he had systematically undertaken to avoid acknowledging the manner in which his systematic construction of control and distance had constituted construction of prison within which his own consciousness was confined. The crisis that emerged from such perception constituted crisis that the Duke undertook to manage through recourse to his habitual mechanisms of control and of distance. He undertook to increase his systematic separation from the household. He undertook to minimize his interactions with Violet to communications of such formality and such emotional distance as to render them nearly mechanical in character. He undertook, in effect, to undertake recommitment to the systematic invisibility that had previously characterized his perception of his wife and to the systematic distance that had previously permitted him to maintain what he perceived as necessary control over his own consciousness and his own emotional responses. Yet the more systematically he undertook to reconstruct the distance that had previously characterized his marriage, the more intensely he became aware of the manner in which such distance constituted not protection, but rather articulation of loss, loss of possibility, loss of what authentic connection might have constituted, loss of transformation that his own consciousness desperately required, but that his systematic defenses had consistently undertaken to prevent. The period that extended into early spring constituted articulation of time, during which the Duke undertook to perceive himself as engaged in struggle against forces that he could not control and against which his habitual mechanisms of defense proved systematically inadequate and systematically counterproductive. The more he attempted to maintain distance, the more acute his awareness became of what such distance had actually cost him. The more he attempted to render Violet invisible through process of systematic ignoring of her presence, the more profoundly her actual grace and her actual character rendered themselves visible to his consciousness. It was during this period of internal conflict and systematic suffering, generated through his own undertaking, to resist what his perception and his consciousness were attempting to articulate regarding Violet and regarding what genuine connection might require, that event occurred which would constitute articulation of such profound character as to render impossible any further undertaking to resist what his consciousness was attempting to communicate to him. The event emerged through circumstance that constituted articulation of genuine danger and of genuine crisis. The Duke, undertaking to engage in matter of estate business that required him to venture into region of moorland at significant distance from the manor, found himself encountering circumstance of such unexpected and such severe character as to render him incapable of undertaking return to the manor through ordinary mechanisms of transportation. His horse became injured through accident of such severity as to render the animal incapable of continued labor. The distance from the manor, combined with approaching darkness and approaching storm that was becoming visible in quality of atmospheric change, rendered his situation one of such genuine danger as to constitute threat to his own survival. It was at this moment, confronted with his own mortality and with his own absolute helplessness in face of circumstance that his authority and his control had no capacity to influence, that the Duke underwent perception of such profound character as to constitute fundamental transformation of his consciousness. In that moment, stripped of all mechanisms of control and all capacity for systematic maintenance of distance, he perceived, with clarity approaching absolute and with intensity approaching overwhelming, the manner in which his systematic construction of isolation and his systematic undertaking to avoid genuine human connection constituted not strength, but rather tragedy of the most profound character. And as the storm closed around him, and as his consciousness began to undergo process of what he perceived as likely final clarity regarding his own existence and his own systematic failure to undertake genuine engagement with human experience and with human connection, his perception of Violet emerged with such intensity as to constitute nearly physical experience. He perceived her face, not as she appeared in ordinary moments of household management and systematic invisibility, but as she appeared in moments when she believed herself unobserved, moments of genuine concern, moments of authentic kindness, moments when her grace emerged without any undertaking to conceal it or to render it invisible. The rescue that preserved his life emerged not through any capacity he possessed to undertake self-preservation, but through circumstance of such remarkable character as to constitute articulation that transcended mere coincidence. Violet had undertaken to locate him through period of evening, when he had failed to return to the manor, with anticipated regularity, commandeered assistance from household staff and from local individuals, and had undertaken systematic search of the moorlands through period of emerging storm. She had undertaken to venture into circumstance of such danger as to render her own survival questionable, driven by concern for him that transcended all systematic attempts at maintenance of distance and that transcended all rationalization regarding what their arrangement had been articulated to constitute. When she discovered him, nearly unconscious, systematic hypothermia approaching dangerous threshold, she undertook to render him assistance with such complete absence of concern regarding her own comfort or her own safety as to communicate with absolute clarity the manner in which his survival had become matter of greater significance to her than her own preservation and her own comfort. The journey back to the manor, undertaken through continuation of storm, with Violet maintaining physical contact with him to undertake transmission of what warmth she could generate, communicating to him through darkness and through storm the truth that he was not alone and that he was not abandoned, constituted experience that rendered impossible any further undertaking to resist what genuine human connection and what authentic grace might actually constitute. By the time they reached the manor, by the time Violet had undertaken to oversee his warming and his restoration to consciousness and to physical safety, the Duke perceived himself as fundamentally transformed in manner that transcended any previous understanding of what personal change or personal growth might actually signify. The man who had constructed himself as individual entirely capable of systematic control and entirely capable of maintenance of emotional distance found himself transformed into individual capable of perceiving that such control had constituted not strength but rather articulation of systematic destruction of his own capacity for authentic human experience. And as he undertook to observe Violet, to truly observe her, without systematic attempt to render her invisible, without systematic undertaking to maintain distance, he perceived within her person not what he had originally articulated as convenient servant of household management, but rather articulation of grace that had been present all along, waiting only for his consciousness to achieve sufficient clarity to perceive what had always existed, her own profound worth, her own authentic beauty, her own capacity for love that transcended all systematic structures of control and distance. The days that extended immediately following the Duke's restoration to consciousness and to physical recovery constituted articulation of period during which the household itself seemed to undergo transformation of such fundamental character as to render visible the manner in which the event of his near death and his rescue constituted articulation of significance extending far beyond the merely personal dimensions of what had transpired. The staff itself perceived, through systematic observation of the Duke's behavior and through observation of the manner in which he undertook to engage with his wife, evidence that something of remarkable character had undergone transformation within the consciousness of their master. The Duke undertook to revise with such systematic deliberation as to render impossible the attribution of such revision to accident or to temporary sentiment generated through circumstance of crisis, the manner in which he had previously maintained his relationship with Violet. He undertook initially with evident difficulty and with manifestation of consciousness that such undertaking required of him capacity for vulnerability that he had systematically attempted to avoid, to acknowledge her presence within his own life with such directness as to constitute articulation that transcended all previous patterns of systematic distance and deliberate invisibility. "I articulate to you," the Duke communicated to Violet, during moment when she had undertaken to attend to his physical recovery through provision of remedies and through oversight of his restoration to complete health, that I perceive myself as requiring to undertake articulation of such significance as to constitute rendering impossible my continued maintenance of the systematic distance that I have previously undertaken to sustain within the context of our arrangement. I articulate that I am required to perceive you as individual, not as mechanism for household management, not as convenient absence of demand upon my consciousness, but as individual of such genuine worth and such authentic capacity for what constitutes human kindness as to render my previous undertaking to render you invisible, constituting articulation of profound betrayal of what you have actually constituted. Violet, observing the Duke undertaking to communicate what constituted for him articulation of such remarkable vulnerability as to approach nearly physical pain, perceived with such remarkable clarity the manner in which his systematic distance had constituted not evidence of disregard, but rather evidence of systematic defense against what his own consciousness had been attempting, across the preceding months, to communicate to him. She perceived that his undertaking to maintain invisibility of her person had constituted systematic resistance to perception that his consciousness could not be prevented from experiencing. "I articulate," Violet responded, voice communicating tone of such gentle kindness as to render nearly physical the manner in which her grace constituted not performance, but rather articulation of her fundamental character. "That I comprehend the manner in which your undertaking to construct distance has constituted undertaking, that was required by circumstances that have shaped your consciousness and that have generated within you perception regarding what emotional engagement might require of you. I articulate that I am not injured by your previous undertaking to render me invisible, for I understand that your doing so constituted articulation of self-protection rather than articulation of disregard for my person or my value." The Duke perceived in Violet's response, and in the remarkable absence within her articulation of any accusation or any demand for acknowledgement of what he had undertaken to deny, evidence of grace that rendered his own previous systematic cynicism and his own previous perception that human kindness constituted weakness or constituted manipulation nearly incomprehensible to him. He undertook to perceive that what he had previously understood as weakness, what Violet had demonstrated through her systematic kindness and through her consistent undertaking to render possible the flourishing of those within her sphere, constituted not weakness but rather articulation of strength, far exceeding what his own systematic construction of distance and systematic maintenance of control had actually constituted. "I articulate that I am required to communicate to you," the Duke said, voice communicating emotion of such profound depth as to constitute nearly articulation of despair regarding his own previous existence, "that there exists within my history circumstance and experience that has generated within me such profound distrust of emotional engagement and such systematic perception that vulnerability constitutes articulation of danger as to render me perceive that construction of absolute control and absolute distance constituted necessary mechanism for preservation of my own consciousness and my own capacity to undertake governance of myself and of the institutions under my authority. Violet undertook to invite him to articulate such history, not through demand or through appeal, but through simple communication of willingness to listen, through demonstration that his articulations would constitute matters of significance to her, and that her consciousness would be engaged in genuine attempt to comprehend what circumstances had generated within him, understanding that had shaped his approach to their arrangement, and to what personal existence might constitute for him. And so the Duke undertook to communicate, perhaps for first time in his existence, narrative regarding his own history, regarding the manner in which he had experienced, during his own youth and during formative period of his consciousness, circumstances of betrayal and of systematic deception that had rendered him perceive that emotional engagement with other individuals constituted articulation of danger and constituted mechanism through which his own consciousness might be rendered vulnerable to harm and to destruction of what he perceived as essential structures of his own identity and his own existence. I articulate that I was engaged, the Duke communicated, in relationship of such profound emotional investment during period when I was young, and when my consciousness was still capable of what might constitute genuine belief in possibility of authentic human connection. I articulate that the individual with whom I undertook such emotional engagement demonstrated such remarkable capacity for systematic deception and such profound undertaking to manipulate my consciousness for purposes of personal advantage as to render me perceive that my systematic investment in the possibility of authentic connection had constituted articulation of profound naivete that had rendered me vulnerable to harm in dimensions that I had not previously articulated as constituting possibility. Violet undertook, with such remarkable tenderness as to constitute nearly physical manifestation of her grace, to listen to articulations that the Duke undertook to communicate regarding his own previous experience of heartbreak and regarding the manner in which such experience had generated within him determination to construct life predicated upon absolute control and absolute maintenance of distance from any individual who might possess capacity to generate within him vulnerability and emotional investment. She undertook not to offer platitude or false comfort, but rather to undertake genuine acknowledgement of the manner in which such experience had constituted matter of profound significance and had generated within him understanding regarding what personal safety and personal survival might require. The weeks that extended into the season of spring, as landscape underwent reconstruction and as dormant earth commenced process of renewal and of emergence into articulation of growth, constituted period during which the Duke undertook systematic reconstruction of his own understanding regarding what strength and what genuine authority might actually constitute. Through continued articulation and through engagement with Violet in manner that constituted genuine dialogue rather than systematic imposition of his will or systematic maintenance of distance, the Duke commenced to perceive that what he had previously articulated as strength, his absolute control, his systematic distance, his refusal to engage with emotional dimensions of existence, had constituted not strength, but rather articulation of systematic destruction of his own capacity for what constituted the most profound dimensions of human experience. I articulate, Sir William Thornton communicated to the Duke, observing the transformation that had been undertaken across preceding weeks and perceiving with remarkable clarity the manner in which genuine change had commenced to manifest within the Duke's consciousness and within his approach to his own existence, that you are undertaking to undergo transformation of such fundamental character as to constitute nearly emergence into new consciousness of what genuine strength and what genuine authority might actually require. I articulate further that I perceive such transformation constitutes matter of such profound significance as to communicate that you have finally undertaken to comprehend what I have articulated to you across many years of our friendship, that control itself constitutes not articulation of strength, but rather articulation of systematic imprisonment of consciousness. The Duke's engagement with Violet took on quality of such remarkable depth and such evident consciousness on his part that she constituted individual worthy of genuine attention and genuine engagement, that the previous systematic invisibility that she had undertaken to cultivate became not merely unnecessary, but actually impossible to maintain. As the Duke undertook to observe her, truly observe her, not merely perceive her as mechanism for household management, he began to perceive dimensions of her character and of her person that rendered previous systematic refusal to acknowledge her constituting articulation of loss of such profound magnitude as to generate within him consciousness of what he had sacrificed through his determination to maintain distance. Yet there emerged, during this period of gradual transformation and of systematic reconstruction of understanding, articulation of complexity that constituted matter of such delicate character as to render necessary the most careful and the most genuine form of engagement on the part of both individuals. For Violet herself possessed history regarding her own understanding of what she constituted and regarding what she perceived as constituting realistic articulation of what her existence might require. She had, across the period of her visible invisibility within her family's household and across the initial period of her marriage to the Duke, constructed understanding of herself as individual whose value was to be found in her capacity to undertake service and support for others, rather than in any articulation of her own worth as individual worthy of being perceived and being valued for her own sake. The transformation that the Duke was undertaking to accomplish through his gradual recognition of her presence and through his systematic undertaking to acknowledge her worth constituted transformation that required, for its genuine accomplishment, transformation also on Violet's part, not transformation of her character or of her essential grace, but rather transformation of her understanding regarding what she constituted and regarding what she possessed right to require from those around her, regarding recognition and regarding genuine engagement with her person and her consciousness. I articulate to you, Violet communicated to the Duke during one conversation that constituted articulation of remarkable vulnerability on her own part, that I perceive myself as requiring to undertake adjustment of understanding regarding what recognition from you might signify, and regarding what such recognition might constitute in terms of what I myself might be permitted to believe regarding my own worth and my own significance. I articulate that I have, across duration of my existence, undertaken systematic construction of understanding that my value constitutes value that is found in what I undertake to accomplish for others, rather than in any articulation of what I myself might constitute as individual worthy of recognition and of engagement. The Duke perceived in Violet's articulation evidence of the manner in which his systematic distance and his systematic undertaking to render her invisible had constituted not merely betrayal of her worth, but also undertaking that had reinforced within her consciousness systematic perception that she herself was not worthy of genuine recognition and of genuine engagement. He perceived that genuine transformation of their relationship and genuine reconstruction of what their connection might constitute required not merely his undertaking to perceive her, but also his undertaking to assist her in reconstruction of her own understanding regarding what she herself might constituting, what she might possess right to require regarding recognition and regarding engagement. I articulate to you, the Duke said, voice communicating emotion of such depth and such evident commitment to what he was attempting to articulate, that you constitute individual of such remarkable worth and such genuine capacity for what constitutes authentic human connection and authentic human grace as to render your previous undertaking to render yourself invisible, constituting articulation of loss, not merely to myself, but to all those whose existence you have touched through systematic manifestation of kindness and understanding. I articulate further that I am required to undertake systematic communication of the manner in which you constitute individual of such significance as to render your presence within my life and within my consciousness matter of profound importance to me, not because of what you undertake to accomplish through your work and through your systematic care for the household and for those within our sphere, but rather because of what you constitute as person and as consciousness engaged in genuine attempt to render possible the flourishing of all those around you. I articulate that I perceive that genuine transformation of what our relationship might constitute requires undertaking on my part to assist you in reconstruction of your own understanding regarding your own worth and your own right to require recognition, and to require engagement that acknowledges not what you accomplish, but what you yourself constitute as individual. I articulate that such undertaking constitutes matter of such significance to me as to constitute something approaching sacred obligation. For I perceive that your systematic rendition of yourself invisible has constituted loss of such profundity as to render necessary undertaking of genuine reconstruction of understanding regarding what you yourself might constitute and what you yourself might possess right to require. The articulation that the Duke undertook to communicate regarding the significance that Violet constituted within his consciousness and within his understanding of what his own existence might require constituted articulation that Violet perceived with such remarkable clarity as to render impossible any undertaking to maintain previous systematic distance or previous undertaking to render herself invisible, as constituting articulation extending far beyond what might constitute mere appreciation or mere acknowledgement of her management of household affairs. The manner in which he undertook to communicate, the evident emotion with which he articulated his perception of her worth and her significance, constituted articulation that communicated something of far greater profundity and something of far greater personal investment than had been present in any previous communication between them. Yet the Duke himself underwent perception of such remarkable clarity regarding the manner in which his articulation of her worth had evolved into articulation that constituted something approaching declaration of emotion of such personal and such profound character as to render unavoidable the acknowledgement that what he had begun to experience constituted not mere appreciation or mere acknowledgement of her person, but rather articulation of feeling that extended into dimensions of emotional engagement that he had systematically attempted to avoid and systematically attempted to deny was possible within the context of his own consciousness. I articulate, the Duke communicated, voice undertaking to articulate with such difficulty as to render visible the extent to which such articulation required of him undertaking of vulnerability that he had previously perceived as nearly impossible, that my communication regarding your worth and your significance has commenced to render visible to my own consciousness the manner in which what I am experiencing constitutes articulation of feeling that transcends what might constitute appreciation or professional recognition. I articulate that I perceive myself as undertaking to experience emotion that I have systematically articulated as impossible within the context of my own existence, emotion that constitutes what might be articulated as love, genuine love, rather than articulation of mere convenience or appreciation or acknowledgement of your utility within the context of our arrangement. The articulation communicated with such evident struggle and with such manifestation of consciousness that such articulation constituted matter of such personal significance as to render him nearly vulnerable to collapse should Violet undertake to respond with rejection or with any articulation that constituted anything less than reciprocal engagement with what he had communicated, generated within Violet response of such remarkable character as to render visible the manner in which she had, across the preceding months, undergone her own systematic transformation regarding what her feelings toward the Duke might actually constitute. I articulate, Violet responded, voice communicating emotion of such depth and such evident authenticity as to constitute nearly articulation of spiritual significance, that I perceive myself as having undertaken, across period of preceding months, systematic transformation of understanding regarding what my own feelings toward you might constitute. I articulate that I entered into our arrangement with understanding that my role constituted role that required me to render myself invisible and to undertake systematic maintenance of distance, such as you yourself had articulated as your requirement. I articulate further that I perceive that systematic rendition of myself invisible has undergone transformation, not through any deliberate intention on my part to alter the nature of what I constituted within our household, but rather through the manner in which your own gradual recognition of my presence has rendered impossible any continued maintenance of the systematic distance and the systematic invisibility that had previously characterized my engagement with you. I articulate that what I have come to perceive and to experience constitutes feeling of such genuine character as to extend far beyond what I had articulated as possible within the context of arrangement that was originally negotiated between us. I articulate that I perceive myself as loving you, not the Duke as institution or mechanism of authority, but rather loving you as individual, with all the complication and all the vulnerability that genuine love actually requires. The mutual articulation of what constituted reciprocal feeling, acknowledgement that both individuals had undergone transformation regarding what their relationship might actually constitute and regarding what emotional investment in one another might signify, constituted moment of such remarkable character and such profound significance as to render nearly physical the manner in which their previous systematic distance had undergone fundamental reconstruction into articulation of something, approaching genuine human connection and genuine mutual engagement. Yet the acknowledgement of such feeling also generated within both individuals consciousness of complication that transcended the merely personal and that required engagement with broader dimensions of what their relationship might constitute within the context of society and within the context of what their public presentation of their marriage and their relationship might articulate regarding what they had become to one another. I articulate Lady Catherine Merrywell, the Duke's aunt, woman of considerable authority and considerable understanding of what genuine wisdom and genuine perception might require, communicated, upon perceiving through systematic observation of both the Duke and Violet, the manner in which their relationship had undergone transformation of such character as to render impossible any continued perception that their arrangement constituted mere convenience, that you both are undertaking to experience transformation of such profound character as to constitute nearly emergence into understanding of what genuine human connection and what authentic love might actually require when undertaken to be rendered visible and when undertaken to be engaged with within the actual mechanics of lived existence and of social reality. I articulate further, Lady Catherine continued, that I perceive such transformation constitutes articulation of such profound significance and such genuine beauty as to render questionable whether the original arrangement that negotiated your union possessed any actual articulation of what I perceive has now become evident, that you both possessed, within your consciousness and within your character, capacity for genuine engagement with one another that required nothing more than systematic destruction of the systematic defenses and the systematic distance that had previously prevented such genuine engagement from manifesting into visibility. As the acknowledgement of reciprocal feeling and the mutual articulation of what genuine love and what authentic connection might constitute, generated within both the Duke and Violet consciousness of such remarkable transformation as to render nearly impossible the manner in which they had previously undertaken to understand themselves and to understand what their relationship might signify. Yet the transformation that had been initiated through such articulation required engagement with processes of such systematic and such comprehensive character as to constitute rendering visible that genuine reconstruction of relationship required reconstruction not merely of emotional engagement, but also of broader understanding regarding what their identities might actually constitute within the context of being perceived and being engaged with, not as distant formal individuals, but as human beings capable of genuine connection and genuine mutual investment. For the Duke, such reconstruction constituted process of nearly systematic dismantling of the identity that he had constructed across preceding decades. The identity of the Duke as individual entirely capable of absolute control, as individual whose authority derived from his systematic distance and his systematic refusal to acknowledge any dimension of himself that constituted vulnerability or that constituted capacity for emotional engagement, extending beyond what institutional obligation might require. The undertaking to reconstruct himself as individual, capable of genuine love, as individual capable of acknowledging vulnerability and emotional investment without perceiving such acknowledgement as constituting threat to his fundamental identity and his fundamental authority, constituted process that required of him consciousness and effort of such magnitude as to constitute nearly emergence into entirely new understanding of what strength and what genuine authority might actually require. I articulate that I perceive myself as requiring to undertake reconstruction of understanding regarding what my own identity might actually constitute, the Duke communicated to Violet, undertaking to articulate process of internal transformation that he was undertaking to accomplish. I articulate that the identity that I constructed, the identity of Duke as individual whose authority derives from his systematic control and his systematic distance, has undergone such fundamental questioning and such systematic destabilization as to render my very consciousness uncertain regarding what I myself might constitute if I undertake to abandon the systematic structures through which I have previously understood myself. I articulate further, the Duke continued, that I perceive such questioning and such destabilization constitutes not threat, but rather articulation of possibility. Possibility that my identity might be reconstructed not through systematic distance and systematic control, but rather through systematic engagement with what genuine responsibility and what genuine care for welfare of those whose existence constitutes consequence of my authority might actually require. I articulate that I perceive you, your presence, your genuine grace, your authentic capacity for kindness, constituting articulation of mirror through which I am capable of perceiving what I myself might become if I undertake to render possible such reconstruction of identity. For Violet, the process of reconstruction constituted process of remarkable different character, not dismantling of previously constructed identity, but rather rendering visible of dimensions of her own consciousness and her own capacity that had been systematically suppressed through her lifetime of rendering herself invisible, and through her lifetime of undertaking to render her own significance secondary to what others might require of her. The acknowledgement of the Duke regarding her worth and her significance constituted acknowledgement that generated within her consciousness such profound shift in understanding regarding what she herself might constitute as individual as to render nearly incomprehensible her previous systematic undertaking to render herself invisible. I articulate that I perceive myself as undertaking to undergo reconstruction of understanding regarding what I myself might constitute, Violet articulated, her voice communicating emotion of such evident depth as to constitute nearly articulation of wonder regarding possibilities she had not previously articulated as constituting actual reality. I articulate that I have, across duration of my existence, constructed understanding that my value and my significance derived from what I undertook to accomplish for others, from my capacity to undertake systematic care and systematic support for those within my sphere. I articulate that your articulation of my own worth as individual, not as mechanism for accomplishment of others' requirements, but as consciousness and as person worthy of recognition and of genuine engagement, has generated within me such fundamental shift in understanding as to render my previous identity nearly unrecognizable. I articulate that I do not perceive such shift as constituting loss, but rather as constituting articulation of emergence into understanding of myself that I had not previously articulated as constituting possibility. I articulate that I perceive myself as undertaking to permit emergence of dimensions of my own consciousness and my own person that have previously been systematically suppressed through my lifetime of rendering myself invisible. I articulate that such emergence constitutes not rejection of what I had previously constituted, for the kindness and the capacity for care that have characterized my existence remain integral to who I am, but rather emergence of permission to permit such kindness and such capacity for care to extend to myself, and to permit myself to articulate significance and worth not merely as mechanism for serving others, but as individual worthy of receiving care and worthy of being valued for what I myself constitute. The mutual process of identity reconstruction and the mutual engagement with the manner in which their relationship had undergone transformation from convenient arrangement into articulation of genuine love and genuine mutual commitment constituted process that generated within both individuals' consciousness of such remarkable shift in understanding regarding what their existence might constitute and what their relationship might signify, not merely within the private dimensions of their own consciousness, but also within the broader context of how they might undertake to present themselves within society and within the institutional apparatus of the dukedom itself. I articulate, Lady Catherine Merriwell communicated, observing the manner in which both the Duke and Violet had commenced to permit emergence of transformed understanding and transformed presentation of themselves within the household and within the broader context of their circumstances, that you have both undertaken to accomplish something of such profound and such genuine beauty as to constitute rendering visible what genuine strength and what genuine grace might actually require when undertaken to be rendered manifest through systematic engagement with authentic human connection and through willingness to undertake vulnerability and emotional investment without perception of such vulnerability as constituting threat to identity or to authority. I articulate that such accomplishment constitutes matter of such significance as to constitute nearly articulation of redemption of what human experience itself might constitute when undertaken to be rendered visible not through systematic distance and systematic control, but through systematic engagement with what genuine love and what authentic grace might actually require. The spring that extended into early summer constituted articulation of season, during which the transformation that had been undertaken by both the Duke and Violet within the private dimensions of their relationship and within the intimate context of Ravensfield Manor commenced to undergo articulation in manner that rendered increasingly visible to broader society and to the institutional apparatus surrounding them the fundamental shift in understanding and in engagement that had characterized their journey from systematic distance toward genuine connection. The transformation became visible initially through mechanisms of such subtlety as to constitute articulation that required genuine perception to recognize, through the manner in which the Duke undertook to engage with Violet in public context, through the manner in which his bearing communicated something extending far beyond the formal courtesy that might constitute requirement of matrimonial arrangement, through the evident consciousness that in the presence of his wife he undertook to manifest something approaching something resembling genuine engagement and genuine interest in her articulations and her observations. Yet it was through occasion of substantial social gathering that constituted articulation of such significance within the annual calendar of the region as to constitute matter of such institutional importance as to render unavoidable the manner in which all members of society would undertake to observe and to articulate understanding regarding what they perceived within the public presentation of the Duke and the Duchess, that the transformation underwent such systematic manifestation as to render impossible any undertaking to maintain perception that the Duke's marriage constituted merely arrangement of convenience and financial advantage. The occasion constituted annual gathering, organized for purpose of bringing together individuals of significant social standing and significant institutional authority within the region, gathering that constituted not merely social event, but rather articulation of matter of such institutional significance as to constitute rendering visible of relationships and of social hierarchies that constituted fundamental dimension of how the society organized itself and articulated its fundamental structures and relationships. And it was during this gathering, as Violet undertook to move through the assembled company, no longer rendering herself invisible through systematic minimization of her presence, but rather permitting emergence of dimensions of her own grace and her own character that had previously been suppressed and concealed, that the manner in which the Duke's perception of her had undergone transformation became visible in manner that rendered undeniable what had transpired within his consciousness and within his understanding of what his wife constituted and what she signified within the context of his own existence and his own identity. The observation that was undertaken by members of society assembled for the occasion constituted observation of such remarkable character as to generate within the community articulation of narrative regarding what had been undertaken by the Duke and Violet and what transformation their relationship had undergone. What had commenced as matter of speculation regarding what the Duke's marriage might constitute, speculative narrative characterized by systematic cynicism regarding whether the arrangement had constituted nothing more than mercenary transaction predicated upon the Duke's desire for household management and the Ashington family's desire for financial rescue, underwent transformation into narrative of such different character as to constitute nearly articulation of romantic sentiment and recognition that genuine transformation of relationship had been undertaken and that the Duke and Duchess had achieved together something that transcended mere institutional arrangement. I articulate, one member of assembled society communicated to another, undertaking to express observation regarding what they had both undertaken to perceive during course of the evening, that the Duke and Duchess have undergone transformation of such profound character as to render nearly incomprehensible the manner in which their marriage has evolved from what was articulated as arrangement of convenience into articulation of something approaching genuine partnership and genuine mutual engagement. I articulate that I perceive in the Duke's manner and in his consciousness a fundamental transformation regarding how he undertakes to understand his wife and regarding what she constitutes within the context of his own existence. I articulate further, the observer continued, that I perceive in the Duchess a manifestation of grace and of genuine presence that renders visible the manner in which what had previously been rendered invisible through her own undertaking to minimize her own significance and her own presence has undergone emergence into visibility and into articulation of such authentic beauty as to constitute nearly evidence that the most profound forms of human connection and human love might emerge not through systematic undertaking to construct relationship through mechanism of strategy or control, but rather through systematic destruction of the defensive structures and the systematic distance that had previously prevented genuine human engagement from manifesting into articulation. Sir William Thornton, observing the manner in which the transformation that he had articulated as necessary and as possible had actually been accomplished and had undergone such manifestation as to render it visible to broader society and to broader institutional context, undertook to communicate to the Duke certain observations regarding what had been accomplished and what the significance of such accomplishment might actually constitute. I articulate to you, Sir William communicated, that you have undertaken to accomplish something of such profound character and such genuine beauty as to constitute rendering visible what genuine strength and what genuine authority might actually require when undertaken to be rendered manifest through systematic willingness to undertake vulnerability and through systematic engagement with what authentic human love and what authentic grace might signify. I articulate that you have rendered visible not merely transformation of your own consciousness, but rather rendering visible of the possibility that institutions and individuals themselves possess capacity for fundamental reconstruction in accordance with principle regarding what genuine human connection and what authentic love might actually require when undertaken to be rendered visible without concern regarding what systematic distance or what institutional convention might prefer. The summer months that extended across the season following the social gathering at which the transformation of the Duke and Violet's relationship had been rendered visible to broader society constituted articulation of period during which the household and the institutional apparatus of Ravensfield Manor itself underwent reconstruction of such systematic and such comprehensive character as to render visible the manner in which genuine change in relationship between husband and wife possessed capacity to generate fundamental transformation in all dimensions of how the household itself was organized and articulated. The transformation emerged initially through mechanisms of such subtle character as to constitute articulation that required genuine perception to recognize through the manner in which the Duke undertook to engage with matters regarding household management in manner that constituted genuine consultation with Violet rather than mere acceptance of her decisions undertaken in isolation and presented as accomplished fact. The Duke commenced to undertake participation in discussions regarding how estate resources might be allocated, regarding what systematic approaches to stewardship might constitute articulation of genuine care for welfare of all those dependent upon the ducal family's authority, regarding what principles might guide the reconstruction of institutional practice in accordance with what authentic responsibility and what genuine care might actually require. I articulate, the Duke communicated to Violet, during one conversation undertaken in the private quarters they now shared with frequency that would have been unthinkable during the initial period of their marriage, that I perceive myself as undertaking to engage in process of learning what genuine partnership and what authentic collaboration regarding stewardship of the institutions under our authority might actually constitute. I articulate that I perceive that your consciousness and your understanding of what care and what responsibility might require constitute articulations of such value and such genuine insight as to render my previous undertaking to maintain exclusive authority regarding such matters, constituting articulation of profound loss and of systematic denial of the capacity that you possess regarding understanding of what authentic stewardship might signify. Violet perceived in the Duke's articulation and in his evident consciousness regarding the manner in which his previous systematic maintenance of exclusive authority had constituted loss rather than articulation of strength, evidence of the manner in which his transformation regarding what she herself constituted as individual was extending into broader dimensions of how he understood authority, how he understood responsibility, and what principles might guide his exercise of power and his stewardship of the institutions under his control. It was during this period of consolidation of new understanding regarding what partnership might constitute that the Duke undertook to introduce systematic changes to the manner in which the estate was managed and the manner in which relationships between the ducal family and all those whose existence constituted consequence of their authority were articulated and maintained. He undertook, with Violet's consultation and with systematic engagement, with what principles regarding genuine care and what authentic stewardship might require, to reconstruct the manner in which tenants were treated, the manner in which workers were compensated, the manner in which children within the broader community were provided with access to education and to systematic support for their development and their flourishing. I articulate, the Duke communicated to the stewards and administrators who undertook management of the estate's affairs, that the manner in which this estate has been previously managed constituted manner predicated upon systematic extraction of maximum resource in service of the Duke's personal wealth and personal authority. I articulate that such approach to stewardship constitutes approach that I now perceive as fundamentally inconsistent with what genuine responsibility and what authentic care for the welfare of all those whose existence constitutes consequence of my authority might actually require. I articulate further, the Duke continued, that we shall undertake systematic reconstruction of the manner in which this estate is managed in accordance with principles regarding what genuine stewardship and what authentic care for human welfare might signify. Such reconstruction shall constitute undertaking that requires that we render visible in systematic application what principle regarding human worth and regarding recognition of dignity might actually require, when undertaken, to be rendered manifest through concrete mechanisms of institutional operation and resource allocation. The stewards and administrators perceived, through the Duke's articulation, and through the evident consciousness that both the Duke and Violet possessed regarding what genuine stewardship might require, evidence of determination to undertake changes that would render visible principles extending far beyond what conventional practice within aristocratic institutions ordinarily permitted or encouraged. Yet the manner in which both the Duke and Violet undertook to communicate such principles, not through articulation of moral superiority or through articulation of romantic sentiment regarding what they believed themselves to be accomplishing, but rather through systematic, practical engagement with what concrete changes might constitute improvement in the lived experience of all those within their sphere of authority, generated within the staff and within the broader community consciousness that the changes being undertaken constituted not temporary enthusiasm, but rather articulation of commitment to genuine reconstruction of what stewardship might signify. Lady Catherine Merrywell, observing the manner in which the Duke and Violet had commenced to undertake systematic implementation of what principles regarding authentic care and authentic responsibility might require in concrete application, perceived with such remarkable clarity the significance of what was being undertaken that she undertook to articulate to the Duke certain observations regarding what she perceived as the ultimate meaning and ultimate significance of the transformation that both he and Violet had undergone. I articulate to you, Lady Catherine communicated, that you have undertaken to accomplish something of such extraordinary institutional and moral significance as to constitute rendering visible what genuine authority and what authentic stewardship might require when undertaken to be exercised not through systematic distance and systematic control, but through systematic engagement with what care and what responsibility toward all those within one's sphere of authority might actually require. I articulate that the principles that you and Violet are rendering visible through your systematic reconstruction of how this estate is managed constitute principles that extend far beyond the merely personal and that constitute rendering visible of possibility that institutions themselves might undergo fundamental reconstruction in accordance with principle regarding human worth and regarding recognition of human dignity. The commencement of autumn constituted articulation of season, during which the systematic changes that the Duke and Violet had undertaken to implement within the management of the estate, and within the broader approach to what stewardship and what responsibility might require, commenced to generate response from elements within the aristocratic establishment and within broader society that constituted articulation of such resistance and such systematic opposition as to render visible the manner in which the principles that the Duke was undertaking to articulate and to implement possessed capacity to constitute threat to the traditional structures through which authority had been maintained and through which social hierarchy had been preserved. Conservative voices within the region, voices representing individuals of significant institutional power and representing traditional approaches to what stewardship and what management of estates and of social relationships might constitute, began to undertake articulation of concern regarding what they perceived as the Duke's systematic departure from conventional practice and his undertaking to implement approaches to management that constituted, in their perception, threat to the very foundations of aristocratic authority and social stability. I articulate, one prominent voice from among the conservative establishment undertook to communicate, that the Duke of Ravensfield has undertaken to embark upon systematic course of action that constitutes articulation of such radical departure from established practice as to generate questions regarding whether he possesses sufficient stability and sufficient commitment to maintenance of the traditional structures through which authority and social order have been preserved to continue to warrant the respect and the confidence that has been traditionally accorded to individuals of his station and his responsibilities. I articulate further, the conservative voice continued, that the manner in which the Duke has commenced to undertake reconstruction of how his estates are managed, through systematic improvement of conditions for tenants, through systematic provision of education for the children of workers, through systematic reconstruction of what compensation and what care for the welfare of those dependent upon his authority might constitutes undertaking that possesses potential to generate expectation among the broader working classes that might render impossible the maintenance of the hierarchical structures upon which social stability itself depends. The criticism that was articulated by conservative elements, whilst constituting articulation of considerable institutional significance, did not possess capacity to dissuade the Duke from continuation of what he had undertaken to commence with Violet. Rather, it constituted articulation that the Duke undertook to engage with through process of systematic articulation of the principles that guided his decisions and his approach to stewardship, through process of attempting to render visible to those who undertook to resist what he was accomplishing, the manner in which genuine care for the welfare of all those dependent upon his authority constituted not threat to legitimate authority, but rather articulation of what genuine authority and what authentic responsibility might actually require. I articulate, the Duke communicated, undertaking to engage in public articulation of what principles guided his reconstruction of estate management, that I perceive genuine authority and genuine stewardship constitute not maintenance of systematic exploitation and systematic maintenance of inequality, but rather undertaking of genuine care for the welfare of all those whose existence constitutes consequence of my exercise of power and my stewardship of authority. I articulate that I perceive that such care requires systematic improvement of living conditions, systematic provision of education, systematic recognition of the human worth and the human dignity of all those whose labor and whose existence renders possible my own position and my own authority. I articulate further, the Duke continued, that I perceive that genuine stability of society does not depend upon systematic maintenance of inequality and upon systematic denial of human worth and human dignity, but rather depends upon systematic recognition that all individuals possess inherent value and that all individuals deserve systematic care and systematic support for their flourishing. I articulate that I undertake to render visible through concrete application what such principle might require and what genuine stewardship might constitute when undertaken to be rendered manifest through commitment to authentic responsibility and authentic care. Sir William Thornton, observing the manner in which the Duke was undertaking to defend and to articulate the principles that guided his reconstruction of institutional practice, undertook to communicate to him certain observations regarding what he perceived as the ultimate significance of what the Duke was attempting to accomplish, and regarding what consequences such undertaking might generate. I articulate to you, Sir William communicated, that you are undertaking to accomplish something of such profound institutional and social significance as to constitute rendering visible what genuine leadership and what authentic stewardship might require. I articulate further that I perceive that the opposition that you are encountering from conservative elements constitutes evidence of the manner in which what you are undertaking constitutes genuine threat to the structures through which power has been traditionally maintained and exercised, not because your approach is irrational or impractical, but rather because it constitutes rendering visible that other approaches might actually be possible, and that systematic improvement in the welfare of those dependent upon aristocratic authority constitutes matter within the realm of genuine possibility. I articulate that I perceive, Sir William continued, that the ultimate consequence of what you are undertaking will extend far beyond your own estate and will extend far beyond the immediate institutional circumstances within which you are operating. I articulate that you are rendering visible what principles regarding genuine stewardship and what authentic care might require, and that such rendering visible constitutes articulation of possibility that will generate systematic questioning regarding how all institutions might be reconstructed in accordance with such principles. Violet herself undertook to engage with the resistance that was being articulated by conservative elements, undertaking to communicate to those who possessed concern regarding the changes that were being implemented, understanding regarding what the Duke was attempting to accomplish, and articulation of the manner in which such accomplishment constituted not threat to genuine stability, but rather articulation of what genuine stewardship and what authentic care for the welfare of all might actually require. I articulate, Violet communicated, engaging directly with women of standing within the community regarding the systematic changes that the Duke had undertaken to implement, that what the Duke is undertaking to accomplish constitutes not systematic destruction of authority, but rather reconstruction of what genuine authority and what authentic stewardship might signify. I articulate that I perceive that genuine strength of society and genuine stability constitutes strength that emerges not through systematic oppression and systematic denial of human worth, but rather through systematic recognition that all individuals deserve care and deserve systematic support for their flourishing. I articulate that I perceive that such recognition constitutes not weakness, but rather articulation of what genuine strength and what authentic responsibility might actually require. The deepening of autumn constituted articulation of season, during which the principles that the Duke and Violet had undertaken to render visible through their systematic reconstruction of how the estate was managed and how relationships between the ducal family and the broader community were articulated, commenced to generate consequences extending far beyond what had been initially articulated or anticipated. Rather than constituting isolated undertaking restricted to the single estate of Ravensfield, the approach that the Duke and Violet had undertaken to implement commenced to constitute example that was beginning to generate consideration and systematic engagement from other members of the aristocratic establishment who had begun to perceive, through observation of what was occurring at Ravensfield, evidence that systematic improvement in the welfare and the care of those dependent upon aristocratic authority possessed capacity to generate benefits extending far beyond the merely moral dimension and extending into dimensions of practical utility and institutional stability. It was during this period of gradual expansion of influence that there emerged alliance of such remarkable and such unexpected character as to render visible the manner in which the principles that the Duke was articulating possessed capacity to generate engagement, even from elements within the aristocratic establishment that had previously constituted sources of systematic resistance to systematic change and to systematic reconstruction of how authority and stewardship might be understood and articulated. One such individual constituted the Earl of Westmore, man of considerable age, of considerable institutional authority, of considerable skepticism regarding the likelihood that systematic change in how estates were managed and how relationships between aristocracy and those dependent upon their authority might be fundamentally reconstructed. Yet the Earl, undertaking to observe the actual results of what the Duke had implemented at Ravensfield, the improved productivity of the estate, the enhanced loyalty and engagement of the workers, the genuine improvement in the living conditions and the well-being of all those dependent upon the ducal family's authority, began to perceive with remarkable clarity that what the Duke had undertaken to accomplish constituted not threat to genuine authority, but rather articulation of what genuine stewardship and what authentic strength might actually require in the context of managing complex institutions and in maintaining the stability of the broader social order. I articulate, the Earl of Westmore communicated to the Duke, undertaking to visit Ravensfield Manor for purpose of examining directly the manner in which the estate was being managed and the principles that guided the Duke's decisions, that I perceive myself as requiring to undergo systematic reconsideration of principles that I have previously articulated as fundamental to the maintenance of authority and the preservation of social stability. I articulate that your undertaking at this estate has rendered visible to me that systematic improvement in the welfare of those dependent upon aristocratic authority constitutes not threat to such authority, but rather articulation of what genuine strength and what authentic stewardship might signify. I articulate that I am beginning to perceive that the conservative resistance to your undertaking constitutes resistance not predicated upon rational principle, but rather predicated upon systematic fear of change and systematic commitment to maintenance of structures that have become habitual, rather than articulation of what genuine principle regarding stewardship and responsibility might actually require. The Earl's articulation of such shift in understanding and his public endorsement of the principles that the Duke had undertaken to implement constituted articulation of such institutional significance as to render visible the manner in which genuine transformation of how society understood what stewardship and what authority might require possessed capacity to extend from individual estates and individual initiatives into broader dimensions of social and institutional change. Other members of the aristocratic establishment, observing the manner in which the Earl, individual of considerable conservative credentials and considerable institutional authority, had undertaken to endorse the Duke's approach to stewardship, commenced themselves to undertake reconsideration of their own approaches and their own understanding regarding what genuine responsibility toward those dependent upon their authority might actually require. I articulate, the Earl communicated further, addressing assembly of other members of the aristocratic establishment, that the Duke of Ravensfield has undertaken to render visible what principle regarding genuine stewardship and what authentic care might require in systematic application. I articulate that I perceive such rendering visible constitutes not attack upon aristocratic authority, but rather rendering visible of what would constitute genuine strength and genuine legitimacy of such authority. I articulate that I perceive that the future of the aristocratic institution itself depends upon our undertaking to reconstruct our understanding regarding what stewardship and what care for the welfare of all those dependent upon our authority might signify. I articulate that I perceive that institutions that undertake such reconstruction will render themselves genuinely relevant and genuinely necessary to the society in which they operate, whilst institutions that undertake to maintain systematic approaches predicated upon exploitation and upon denial of human worth will render themselves increasingly vulnerable to questioning and to systematic loss of legitimacy. Yet it was Violet herself who undertook to articulate with such remarkable clarity and with such genuine understanding of what broader implications the transformation at Ravensfield might possess, the manner in which the principles that she and the Duke had rendered visible through their own personal transformation and through their systematic reconstruction of how authority and stewardship might be articulated, extended far beyond the merely institutional and extended into fundamental dimensions of how society itself might come to understand what genuine strength and what authentic care and what authentic responsibility might actually constitute. I articulate, Violet communicated, undertaking to address gathering of women of considerable social standing within the region, that what the Duke and I have undertaken to render visible through reconstruction of how Ravensfield is managed, and through systematic demonstration of what principles regarding genuine care and authentic stewardship might require in concrete application, constitutes rendering visible of principle that extends far beyond the merely institutional. I articulate that I perceive that what we are rendering visible constitutes principle regarding what authentic strength and what genuine grace might signify, not as articulation of weakness or of sentimentality, but rather as articulation of what genuine power and what genuine authority might actually require, when undertaken to be exercised in service of all those whose welfare constitutes consequence of our exercise of authority and our stewardship of responsibility. I articulate further," Violet continued, "that I perceive that the transformation of society toward greater recognition of human worth and toward greater commitment to care for the welfare of all constitutes transformation that requires not systematic destruction of institutions of authority, but rather systematic reconstruction of how such institutions understand themselves and understand what genuine responsibility and what authentic stewardship might signify. I articulate that I perceive that such reconstruction constitutes undertaking of such profound significance as to constitute rendering visible of what genuine strength and what authentic grace might require when undertaken to be rendered manifest through systematic commitment to authentic responsibility and genuine care. The transition from autumn into the early months of winter constituted articulation of period during which the Duke and Violet undertook to engage in processes of such remarkable depth and such evident mutual investment as to render visible the manner in which genuine love and genuine partnership required not merely public demonstration and not merely systematic reconstruction of institutional practice, but rather required ongoing processes of authentic vulnerability and of systematic engagement with the dimensions of their own consciousness and their own being, that required continuous undertaking of transformation and continuous willingness to permit themselves to be perceived and to be known by one another in dimensions that extended far beyond what either had previously articulated as constituting possibility within the context of matrimonial relationship. The Duke undertook to articulate, with increasing frequency and with increasing consciousness, of the manner in which such articulation constituted systematic rendering visible of dimensions of his own consciousness that he had previously perceived as matters requiring concealment and protection, the precise nature of the experiences that had generated within him the systematic fear and systematic resistance to emotional engagement that had characterized his consciousness prior to his undertaking to recognize Violet and to permit himself to experience the vulnerability and the investment that love actually required. "I articulate that I perceive," the Duke communicated during one conversation, undertaken in the private chambers they shared during the increasing coldness of approaching winter, "that the betrayal that I experienced during my youth constituted betrayal of such profound character as to generate within me not merely distrust of the individual who perpetrated such betrayal, but rather systematic distrust of all human connection and systematic perception that emotional investment in any individual constituted articulation of profound danger and profound foolishness. I articulate that I perceived that the only mechanism through which I could protect myself from experiencing such betrayal again constituted mechanism of absolute control and absolute maintenance of distance from all individuals who possessed capacity to generate within me emotional investment. I articulate further," the Duke continued, "that I perceive now that such perception and such undertaking to protect myself through systematic distance constituted protection that generated far greater harm and far greater cost than the original betrayal itself. I articulate that in undertaking to protect myself from the possibility of experiencing pain, I undertook to render impossible the experiencing of joy and genuine human connection. I articulate that I perceive that genuine strength and genuine courage constitute not systematic protection from pain through maintenance of distance, but rather systematic willingness to undertake vulnerability and to permit oneself to be known and to be engaged with by another consciousness, despite the risk that such engagement constitutes." Violet, for her own part, undertook to articulate with increasing specificity the manner in which her systematic rendering of herself invisible had constituted not merely response to external circumstances of her family's reduced situation, but rather had constituted systematic undertaking to protect herself from the pain that might emerge from articulation of her own significance and her own worth. She undertook to communicate understanding regarding the manner in which her previous commitment to rendering herself invisible had been predicated, at least partially, upon systematic fear that if she permitted herself to become visible, and if she permitted herself to articulate her own worth and her own significance, she might be rejected or dismissed or rendered subject to ridicule and to systematic negation of the value that she might claim for herself. "I articulate," Violet communicated, that I perceived that my previous undertaking to render myself invisible constituted undertaking that was predicated upon fear. Fear that if I permitted myself to become visible, and if I undertook to articulate my own significance and my own worth, I might discover that in fact I possessed no actual worth, and that my invisibility constituted protection not from rejection, but rather constituted mechanism for avoiding the articulation of what I suspected might be fundamental truth regarding my own insignificance and my own absence of actual value. I articulate that your articulation of my worth, Violet continued, addressing the Duke directly, constituted not merely expression of your affection, but rather undertaking that rendered impossible for me to maintain the systematic perception that I possessed no actual value and no actual significance. I articulate that your systematic rendering visible of my grace and my significance has constituted undertaking that has generated within me capacity to perceive myself as individual worthy of recognition and worthy of genuine engagement, not because I have fundamentally changed who I am, but rather because I have been rendered permission to permit what I actually constitute as individual to become visible and to be engaged with genuinely. The mutual articulation of fear and vulnerability, the mutual undertaking to render visible the dimensions of consciousness and experience that had previously been concealed, constituted articulation of such remarkable intimacy and such genuine openness as to render visible the manner in which authentic love and authentic partnership required engagement with one's own consciousness and one's own being at level of such depth as to constitute nearly spiritual engagement with what one's fundamental identity might constitute and what one might be capable of becoming through process of systematic vulnerability and systematic willingness to be known by another. Sir William Thornton, observing the manner in which the Duke and Violet had undertaken to engage in such processes of mutual vulnerability and mutual articulation of what had previously been concealed, undertook to articulate to the Duke certain observations regarding the significance of what he was undertaking and regarding what such undertaking might constitute in terms of what genuine strength and what authentic manhood might actually require. I articulate to you, Sir William communicated, that you have undertaken to accomplish something of such genuine difficulty and such profound courage as to constitute rendering visible what authentic masculinity and what genuine strength might actually require. I articulate that you have rendered visible that strength does not constitute maintenance of distance and maintenance of control, but rather constitutes systematic willingness to undertake vulnerability and to permit oneself to be known and to be engaged with by another consciousness, despite the risk that such engagement constitutes. I articulate further, Sir William continued, that I perceive that the manner in which you are undertaking to engage with your own consciousness and your own vulnerability constitutes example that extends far beyond the merely personal, and that constitutes rendering visible of possibility that all individuals might undertake, the possibility that authentic strength and authentic courage constitute not maintenance of defensive structures, but rather systematic willingness to engage with one's own consciousness and one's own being in dimensions of such honesty and such openness as to constitute nearly spiritual engagement with what one might actually be capable of becoming. The approach of the winter solstice and the commencement of the season of celebration and of renewal constituted articulation of period during which the Duke and Violet undertook to engage in systematic reflection regarding what they had accomplished across the preceding months and years and regarding what foundation they had established through their undertaking to reconstruct their understanding regarding what love, what partnership, what authority, and what genuine stewardship might actually require in systematic application and in authentic engagement with lived experience and with institutional reality. The legacy that the Duke and Violet had undertaken to establish constituted legacy that extended far beyond the merely personal and extended far beyond the immediate institutional apparatus of Ravensfield Manor. Through their systematic reconstruction of how the estate was managed, through their articulation of principles regarding what genuine care and what authentic stewardship might require, through their public demonstration of the manner in which love and partnership and mutual vulnerability constituted not weakness but rather articulation of authentic strength and authentic grace, they had begun to render visible to broader society and to broader institutional contexts the possibility that, Systematic transformation of how authority was understood and how responsibility was articulated constituted undertaking that was not merely possible, but constituted undertaking that was necessary if institutions and society itself were to render themselves genuinely relevant and genuinely legitimate in the consciousness of all those whose existence constituted consequence of institutional exercise of authority and power. I articulate, Lady Catherine Merriwell communicated, undertaking to address the Duke and Violet together during gathering of considerable significance undertaken within the manor as celebration of what they had accomplished and as articulation of gratitude for the transformation that they had rendered visible, that you have undertaken to accomplish something of such extraordinary institutional, social, and spiritual significance as to constitute rendering visible what genuine love and what authentic grace might require when undertaken to be rendered manifest through systematic commitment to principle regarding human worth and regarding recognition of human dignity. I articulate further, Lady Catherine continued, that I perceive that the legacy that you are establishing constitutes legacy that will extend far beyond your own lives and far beyond the immediate circumstances of Ravensfield Manor. I articulate that you are rendering visible what principles regarding genuine authority and what authentic stewardship might require, and that such rendering visible constitutes articulation of such fundamental significance as to possess capacity to generate systematic questioning and systematic reconstruction throughout the broader fabric of society and institutional practice. The Duke himself undertook to articulate, with such remarkable consciousness of what he and Violet had accomplished, and with such evident understanding of what the ultimate significance of their undertaking might constitute, certain reflections regarding what he perceived as fundamental meaning of the transformation that they had undergone, and regarding what he perceived as essential character of what legacy they were establishing. I articulate, the Duke communicated, that I perceive that the greatest gift that Violet has rendered to me constitutes gift not of financial advantage or of household management, but rather gift of rendering visible the possibility that I myself might be capable of transformation, that I might be capable of abandoning the systematic structures of control and distance through which I had previously understood myself and through which I had previously undertaken to navigate my existence. I articulate that I perceive that such transformation constitutes transformation that extends far beyond the merely personal and extends into understanding of what genuine authority and what authentic stewardship might require. I articulate further, the Duke continued, that I perceive that the principle regarding human worth and regarding recognition of human dignity that Violet has rendered visible through her own consistent manifestation of grace and through her systematic care for the welfare of all those within her sphere of influence, constitutes principle that possesses capacity to transform not merely individual lives, but also to transform institutions and to transform society itself. I articulate that I perceive that such transformation constitutes undertaking of such fundamental significance as to constitute nearly sacred obligation to render visible through concrete application what such principles might require and what genuine authority and authentic stewardship might actually signify. Violet herself undertook to articulate understanding regarding the legacy that she and the Duke were establishing and regarding what she perceived as ultimate meaning of the transformation that she had undergone from invisibility into articulation of genuine presence and genuine significance. I articulate, Violet communicated, that I perceive that my own transformation from systematic invisibility into articulation of genuine presence and genuine recognition constitutes transformation that is not unique to my own personal circumstances, but rather constitutes transformation that is reflective of what might become possible for all individuals whose value and whose significance have been systematically denied or systematically rendered invisible through processes of institutional and social practice that have historically maintained that only certain individuals possessed sufficient worth to merit recognition and genuine engagement. I articulate further, Violet continued, that I perceive that the principle regarding human worth and regarding recognition of human dignity that the Duke and I have undertaken to render visible through our own personal transformation and through our systematic reconstruction of how authority and stewardship might be articulated constitutes principle that possesses capacity to generate genuine social transformation. I articulate that I perceive that such transformation requires not systematic destruction of institutions of authority, but rather systematic reconstruction of how such institutions understand themselves and understand what genuine responsibility and what authentic care for the welfare of all might signify. I articulate that I perceive, Violet concluded, her voice communicating such emotion of such depth as to constitute nearly articulation of spiritual significance, that the greatest gift that I have received does not constitute gift of recognition or of elevated social position, but rather constitutes gift of being permitted to render visible what I actually constitute as individual, and to undertake systematic engagement in rendering visible what principles regarding human dignity and genuine care might require in concrete application and in authentic commitment to stewardship of all those whose welfare constitutes consequence of our exercise of authority and influence. I articulate that such gift constitutes gift of such profound significance as to constitute rendering possible of what authentic meaning and authentic purpose in human existence might actually require. The winter months that extended across the season of celebration and of systematic reflection constituted articulation of period during which the opposition that conservative elements within the aristocratic establishment had previously articulated regarding the Duke's systematic reconstruction of how authority and stewardship might be understood underwent transformation of such remarkable character as to render visible the manner in which the principles that the Duke and Violet had rendered visible through their own personal transformation and through their institutional reconstruction, possessed capacity to generate consequences extending far beyond what had been initially anticipated or articulated by either the Duke himself or by those who undertook to resist what he was attempting to accomplish. The moment of such transformation constituted moment that arrived through circumstance of such seemingly minor character as to render nearly invisible the manner in which it would constitute articulation of such fundamental significance as to render the opposition of conservative elements essentially impotent and essentially irrelevant to the ongoing process of social and institutional reconstruction that was occurring throughout the region. It was the Earl of Westmore who undertook, in his capacity as individual of considerable institutional authority within the region, and individual whose previous skepticism had undergone transformation into genuine endorsement of the Duke's principles, to articulate before the assembled aristocratic establishment certain observations regarding the manner in which those who undertook to resist the changes being implemented at Ravensfield possessed neither rational argument nor institutional justification for such resistance. I articulate, the Earl communicated, his voice communicating authority that derived from decades of engagement with institutional politics and from consciousness of the significance of what he was undertaking to articulate, that those among us who have undertaken to articulate resistance to the principles that the Duke of Ravensfield is rendering visible through his systematic reconstruction of how authority and stewardship might be understood, possess neither rational justification nor institutional legitimacy for such resistance. I articulate that the results of what the Duke has undertaken to implement at Ravensfield constitutes evidence that systematic improvement in the welfare of those dependent upon aristocratic authority generates not threat to such authority, but rather strengthening of the legitimacy and the stability upon which such authority actually depends. I articulate further, the Earl continued, that I perceive that those who continue to undertake articulation of resistance do so not on basis of rational principle, but rather on basis of systematic fear regarding what systematic change might require in terms of modification of their own understanding regarding what authority and stewardship might constitute. I articulate that I perceive that the future of the aristocratic institution itself depends upon our willingness to undertake the very reconstruction that the Duke is rendering visible, and that those institutions and those individuals who undertake to resist such reconstruction will render themselves increasingly vulnerable to questioning and to systematic loss of legitimacy within the consciousness of those whose welfare constitutes consequence of our exercise of authority. The articulation of such observation by individual of such considerable institutional standing and such considerable conservative credentials possessed significance of such magnitude as to constitute rendering visible to all assembled that the position of those who undertook to resist the Duke's reconstruction of authority and stewardship had been fundamentally undermined, and that systematic opposition to what the Duke was attempting to accomplish constituted position that would become increasingly isolated and increasingly irrelevant within the context of broader social and institutional transformation that was occurring. Yet it was through articulation undertaken by one member of the conservative establishment, individual of considerable age and considerable attachment to traditional approaches, that the precise nature of what was occurring within the broader transformation became fully articulated. The individual, recognizing that the position of conservative resistance had been fundamentally undermined and that the legitimacy of such resistance had been systematically questioned by the Earl of Westmore, undertook to articulate observation that constituted articulation of such remarkable clarity as to render visible the manner in which what was occurring constituted not merely institutional change, but rather constituted articulation of fundamental transformation in how society itself understood what genuine authority, what authentic stewardship and what authentic strength might actually require. "I articulate," the conservative individual communicated, his voice communicating such consciousness of having perceived something of profound significance as to constitute nearly articulation of spiritual awakening, "that I perceive myself as required to acknowledge that what the Duke of Ravensfield has undertaken to render visible through his own personal transformation and through his systematic reconstruction of how authority and stewardship might be articulated constitutes rendering visible of principle that extends far beyond the merely institutional, and that constitutes rendering visible of what fundamental human truth and what authentic principle regarding human worth and human dignity might actually require in concrete application and in authentic commitment. "I articulate that I perceive," the individual continued, "that those of us who have undertaken to resist such rendering visible have been resisting not because the principle is false, but rather because such rendering visible constitutes threat to the structures through which we have maintained our own position and our own sense of authority. I articulate that I perceive that genuine courage and genuine integrity require that we undertake to acknowledge such resistance as having been predicated upon self-interest rather than upon principle, and that we undertake to reconstruct our own understanding regarding what genuine authority and what authentic stewardship might require." The articulation of such observation by member of conservative establishment, combined with the Earl of Westmore's public endorsement of the Duke's principles, constituted articulation that rendered essentially complete the transformation of how the aristocratic establishment understood and engaged with the principles that the Duke and Violet had rendered visible through their own personal transformation and through their systematic reconstruction of institutional practice. The transition from winter into the season of spring constituted articulation of period, during which the systematic changes that had been initiated at Ravensfield Manor and that had been rendered visible to broader society throughout the preceding year underwent expansion and systematic consolidation in manner that rendered the transformation of how society understood what authority and stewardship might constitute essentially irreversible and essentially institutional rather than merely the undertaking of a single individual or a single estate. Throughout the region, other members of the aristocratic establishment commenced to undertake reconstruction of how their own estates were managed, commenced to implement systematic improvements in the welfare of those dependent upon their authority, commenced to articulate understanding that genuine stewardship and authentic care for the welfare of all constituted not weakness, but rather articulation of what genuine strength and authentic authority might actually require. The transformation that had commenced with the Duke's systematic reconstruction of Ravensfield Manor had undergone expansion into undertaking of such magnitude as to constitute systematic reshaping of how the entire region approached what institutional governance and what stewardship of authority might signify. The most visible articulation of such transformation emerged through the systematic establishment, throughout the region, and indeed throughout broader society, of institutions and mechanisms through which the principle that all individuals possessed inherent worth and deserved systematic care and support for their flourishing might be rendered manifest in concrete application. Schools were established. Mechanisms for systematic provision of adequate compensation and adequate working conditions were implemented. Institutions dedicated to the welfare of the poor and the vulnerable were reconstructed in accordance with principle regarding what authentic care and what genuine stewardship might require. Yet it was through articulation undertaken by the Duke himself, during public address delivered to assembled members of aristocratic and civic leadership within the region, that the ultimate significance of what had been accomplished through the systematic reconstruction of authority and stewardship was rendered fully visible and fully articulated. "I articulate," the Duke communicated, his voice communicating such consciousness of the significance of what he was undertaking to articulate as to constitute nearly spiritual depth, "that we have undertaken collectively to render visible and to render manifest in concrete institutional application principle, regarding human worth and regarding authentic responsibility that constitutes principle of such fundamental significance as to constitute nearly articulation of what genuine civilization and what authentic society might require in systematic commitment and in authentic engagement with lived experience and with human flourishing. I articulate further," the Duke continued, "that I perceive that what we are undertaking to accomplish extends far beyond the merely institutional and extends far beyond the merely social. I articulate that I perceive that we are undertaking to render visible what fundamental human truth regarding the worth of all individuals and regarding the necessity of systematic care for the welfare of all might require in terms of how we understand ourselves as individuals and how we understand our obligations toward all those whose welfare constitutes consequence of our exercise of authority and influence. I articulate that I perceive," the Duke concluded, "that the principle that we are rendering visible constitutes principle that will continue to extend and continue to deepen across generations, and that future generations will look back upon this period as articulation of moment at which society undertook to commence reconstruction of how it understood what genuine authority, what authentic stewardship, and what authentic responsibility toward all members of the human community might actually require." Violet herself undertook to articulate, through her own engagement with the systematic reconstruction of how society understood and approached the welfare of all members of the community, understanding regarding the manner in which the principle that had been rendered visible through her own personal transformation and through the Duke's systematic reconstruction of authority and stewardship extended to all individuals and required of all individuals' willingness to undertake systematic examination of how they exercised authority and how they approached their own responsibilities toward those whose welfare constituted consequence of their actions and their choices. The systematic transformation that had been initiated through the Duke's and Violet's personal engagement with principles regarding human worth and regarding authentic stewardship had undergone expansion into undertaking of such magnitude and such comprehensive character as to constitute rendering visible throughout the broader fabric of society evidence that systematic change in how authority was understood and how responsibility was approached constituted undertaking that was not merely possible but constituted undertaking that was essential and that was already occurring in systematic and increasingly irreversible manner. The months that extended across the full flowering of spring and into the abundant season of summer constituted articulation of period during which the Duke and Violet undertook to engage in processes of such remarkable spiritual and emotional depth as to render visible the manner in which the personal transformation they had undergone and the love that had emerged between them constituted not temporary phenomenon, but rather constituted transformation of such fundamental character and such profound significance as to constitute rendering visible of what authentic love and what genuine partnership might actually require in terms of ongoing commitment to vulnerability and ongoing willingness to permit oneself to be known and engaged with by another consciousness in dimensions of such honesty and such depth as to constitute nearly sacred dimension of human experience. The Duke undertook to articulate, in conversations undertaken in the private chambers they shared, and in moments of such intimate engagement as to constitute rendering visible of dimensions of his consciousness that he had previously perceived as matters requiring systematic concealment, the manner in which his journey from systematic distance and systematic control toward what Violet had rendered visible as authentic love and genuine vulnerability constituted journey that had fundamentally transformed not merely his understanding of what love might constitute, but rather had transformed his fundamental understanding of what genuine strength, what authentic courage, and what genuine meaning in human existence might actually require. I articulate that I perceive, the Duke communicated, his voice communicating emotion of such depth as to constitute nearly articulation of spiritual experience, that I have undertaken to undergo transformation of such comprehensive character as to constitute nearly emergence into entirely different understanding of what my own existence might constitute and what genuine meaning and authentic purpose might signify in the context of lived experience and in the context of engagement with another consciousness in manner that requires systematic vulnerability and systematic willingness to be known. I articulate that I perceive, the Duke continued, that what you have rendered visible through your own consistent manifestation of grace and through your systematic commitment to caring for the welfare of all those within your sphere of influence constitutes rendering visible of what principle regarding authentic strength and what genuine courage might require, not the courage to maintain control and systematic distance, but rather the courage to render yourself vulnerable and to permit yourself to be known and to be engaged with, without systematic protection of your own consciousness and your own being. I articulate further, the Duke concluded, that I perceive that the greatest gift that you have given to me constitutes gift not of institutional advantage or of household management, but rather constitutes gift of rendering visible the possibility that I myself might undergo transformation, and that I myself might become capable of what I had previously perceived as impossible: genuine love, authentic vulnerability, and authentic engagement with another consciousness in dimensions of such honesty and such spiritual depth as to constitute nearly sacred undertaking. Violet herself undertook to articulate, with such remarkable consciousness of what she had experienced through the Duke's systematic undertaking, to recognize her and to render visible her worth and her significance, the manner in which his recognition had generated within her not merely recognition of his own transformation, but rather had generated within her consciousness of the manner in which being genuinely seen and being genuinely recognized by another individual constituted experience of such profound spiritual significance as to constitute nearly transformation of the very foundation of her understanding regarding what her own existence might constitute and what meaning and authentic purpose might signify in the context of human connection and mutual engagement. I articulate, Violet communicated, that I perceive that the greatest gift that I have received constitutes gift not of elevated social position or of material advantage, but rather constitutes gift of being genuinely seen and being genuinely recognized as individual worthy of attention and worthy of authentic engagement. I articulate that I perceive that being genuinely seen by another consciousness in manner that acknowledges my worth and my significance constitutes experience of such profound spiritual character as to constitute nearly transformation of my understanding regarding what love and what authentic human connection might actually require. I articulate further, Violet continued, that I perceive that what we have undertaken together, both the personal transformation that we have experienced individually and the institutional and social transformation that we have rendered visible through our commitment to principles regarding human worth and regarding authentic stewardship, constitutes undertaking of such profound significance as to constitute rendering visible of what genuine love and what authentic grace might require when undertaken to be rendered manifest not merely in personal relationship, but in systematic commitment to care for the welfare of all those whose existence constitutes consequence of our exercise of authority and influence. The spiritual depth that characterized the relationship between the Duke and Violet, the manner in which their love had become articulation of not merely emotional connection, but rather articulation of commitment to principles regarding human worth and regarding authentic responsibility, the manner in which their personal transformation had undergone extension into broader institutional and social transformation, constituted articulation of such remarkable character as to render visible evidence that genuine love and authentic partnership possessed capacity to generate consequences, extending far beyond the merely personal and extending into fundamental reconstruction of how society itself understood what genuine strength, what authentic authority, and what authentic care for the welfare of all members of the human community might actually require. The approach of autumn and the commencement of the period of year that marked the anniversary of the Duke's rescue and Violet's demonstration of the authentic love and authentic concern that had generated within him consciousness requiring fundamental transformation of his understanding regarding what emotional engagement and what genuine connection might constitute, constituted articulation of period, within which both the Duke and Violet undertook to engage in processes of reflection and articulation of meaning, such as to render visible their consciousness of what ultimate significance, the entire process of their transformation and the transformation they had rendered visible to broader society might actually constitute in terms of what genuine meaning and what authentic purpose in human existence might require. I articulate, the Duke communicated, undertaking to address Violet and to articulate certain reflections regarding what he perceived as the fundamental meaning of the transformation that they had undergone together and that they had rendered visible to broader society, that I perceive myself as required to acknowledge that the journey that we have undertaken together, your journey from systematic invisibility toward genuine recognition, my journey from systematic control toward authentic vulnerability, constitutes journey that has rendered visible what I now perceive as fundamental principle regarding what genuine human existence and what authentic meaning in life might actually constitute. I articulate that I perceive, the Duke continued, that I have spent decades of my existence undertaking to construct life predicated upon systematic control, upon systematic distance from authentic human connection, upon systematic refusal to acknowledge dimensions of my own consciousness and my own being that required vulnerability and that required willingness to be known by another. I articulate that I perceive that such construction constituted construction not of strength, but rather of systematic imprisonment of my own consciousness and my own capacity for what genuine joy and what authentic meaning might actually require. I articulate further, the Duke concluded, that I perceive that the transformation that you have rendered visible to me and the manner in which you have required of me genuine engagement with my own vulnerability and genuine willingness to be known has constituted undertaking that has liberated me not from authority or from responsibility, but rather has liberated me from the systematic structures of defense and distance that had previously rendered impossible my capacity to experience authentic love, authentic joy, and authentic engagement with what genuine meaning in human existence might actually constitute. Violet herself undertook to articulate certain reflections regarding what she perceived as fundamental significance of her own transformation and regarding what ultimate meaning such transformation might possess, not merely for her own personal existence, but for broader understanding regarding what authentic human worth and what authentic recognition of human dignity might require in systematic application. I articulate, Violet communicated, that I perceive that my own journey from systematic invisibility toward genuine recognition constitutes journey that renders visible what principle regarding human worth and regarding recognition of human dignity might require when undertaken to be rendered manifest in systematic application and in authentic commitment. I articulate that I perceive that my invisibility constituted not merely personal circumstance, but rather constituted articulation of broader social and institutional practice through which certain individuals have been systematically rendered invisible and through which their worth and their significance have been systematically denied or negated. I articulate further, Violet continued, that I perceive that my own recognition and my own rendering visible as individual worthy of attention and worthy of authentic engagement constitutes recognition and rendering visible that extends far beyond my personal circumstances, and that constitutes nearly symbolic articulation of what recognition of the worth and the dignity of all individuals who have been systematically rendered invisible through processes of social and institutional practice might actually require. I articulate that I perceive that the principle that the Duke and I have rendered visible through our personal transformation and through our systematic reconstruction of authority and stewardship constitutes principle that extends far beyond our own circumstances, and that constitutes principle regarding what genuine respect for human worth and what authentic care for the welfare of all might require in systematic application throughout the broader fabric of society and institutional practice. The reflections that both the Duke and Violet undertook to articulate regarding the ultimate meaning and the ultimate significance of the transformation they had undergone together and that they had rendered visible to broader society constituted articulation that rendered visible the manner in which their personal journey and the broader social transformation that they had rendered visible possessed significance extending far beyond the merely personal and extending into fundamental. Dimensions of what genuine meaning, what authentic purpose, and what genuine human flourishing might actually require in the context of lived experience and in the context of systematic commitment to principles regarding human worth and regarding authentic care for the welfare of all members of the human community. The approach of the winter season and the commencement of another cycle of celebration and of renewal constituted articulation of period within which the Duke and Violet, in consultation with all those who had undertaken to engage in the systematic reconstruction of how authority and stewardship might be understood and articulated throughout the region, undertook to organize gathering of such remarkable scope and such profound institutional significance as to constitute rendering visible to all, assembled the complete transformation that had been accomplished and the new order that had been established through collective commitment to principles regarding human worth, regarding authentic stewardship, and regarding genuine care for the welfare of all members of the community. The gathering itself constituted assembly of individuals from all levels of society, aristocracy that had undertaken to reconstruct how they understood authority and stewardship, workers whose welfare had been improved through systematic implementation of principles regarding authentic care and genuine responsibility, children who had been rendered access to education and systematic support for their development and flourishing, individuals of modest means who had been rendered participation in decision-making regarding how their communities were organized and managed. The assembly constituted visible and tangible articulation of what genuine society and what authentic community might require in systematic commitment to recognition of human worth and in systematic undertaking to render possible the flourishing of all individuals within its sphere of influence. It was during this gathering, as the Duke undertook to address all those assembled, and as he undertook to articulate certain vision regarding what future might be constructed through continued commitment to principles that had been rendered visible through the transformation he and Violet had undergone, and that they had rendered manifest in institutional and social practice, that the ultimate significance of what had been accomplished and what might yet be accomplished through continued commitment to such principles was rendered fully visible and fully articulated. "I articulate," the Duke communicated, his voice communicating such depth of consciousness regarding the significance of what he was undertaking to articulate as to constitute nearly spiritual pronouncement, "that we have undertaken together to accomplish something of such profound significance and such genuine beauty as to constitute rendering visible what authentic society and what genuine community might require in systematic commitment to principles regarding human worth and regarding recognition of human dignity. I articulate further," the Duke continued, "that I perceive that what we have begun constitutes beginning of transformation that will extend far beyond our own lives and far beyond our own time. I articulate that I perceive that we have rendered visible principle that all individuals possess inherent worth and deserve systematic care and support for their flourishing, and that such principle, once rendered visible and once demonstrated in concrete application, possesses capacity to generate transformation that will continue to extend and continue to deepen across generations. I articulate that I perceive," the Duke concluded, speaking with such intensity of feeling as to render his words nearly articulation of sacred truth, "that the vision that I articulate for the future constitutes vision of society that is organized not upon basis of systematic extraction and systematic oppression, but rather upon basis of systematic recognition that all individuals possess worth and dignity and deserve participation in community that undertakes to render possible their flourishing and their authentic engagement in processes of mutual care and mutual support. I articulate that I perceive that such society is not distant dream, but rather constitutes undertaking that we are already rendering visible and that we are already accomplishing through our systematic commitment to principles regarding human worth and regarding authentic stewardship." Violet herself undertook to address all those assembled, and in her articulation she rendered visible the manner in which the transformation from invisibility to recognition, the transformation from systematic negation of worth to systematic articulation of authentic significance, extended to all individuals and constituted undertaking that required of all individuals willingness to undertake examination of how they exercised authority and how they approached their responsibilities toward those whose welfare constituted consequence of their actions and their choices. I articulate, Violet communicated, her voice communicating such emotion of such depth as to constitute nearly articulation of spiritual truth, that I perceive myself as having been rendered visible not merely for my own sake, but as articulation of what recognition of the worth and the dignity of all individuals who have been systematically rendered invisible might constitute. I articulate that I perceive that my transformation and my rendering visible constitute symbolic articulation of what systematic recognition of human worth and what authentic care for the welfare of all might require. I articulate further, Violet concluded, that I perceive that the vision that the Duke has articulated regarding future constitutes vision that requires of all of us willingness to undertake systematic commitment to rendering visible what human worth and what authentic dignity might require. I articulate that I perceive that such undertaking constitutes undertaking that is not merely moral obligation, but rather constitutes undertaking that is essential to creation of society and community within which all individuals might experience authentic flourishing and authentic engagement in processes of mutual care and mutual support. The years that extended beyond the period of transformation and beyond the moment at which the new order had been rendered visible and rendered manifest in institutional and social practice constituted years during which the principles that the Duke and Violet had rendered visible through their own personal journey and through their systematic reconstruction of authority and stewardship continued to extend and to deepen throughout the broader fabric of society. The children born to the Duke and Violet, children who grew in consciousness of what authentic love and what genuine partnership between their parents constituted, children who understood from their earliest consciousness that all individuals possessed inherent worth and deserved systematic care and support for their flourishing, became carriers of the principle that their parents had rendered visible, and through their own lives and through their own engagement with broader society, they undertook to extend and to deepen the transformation that their parents had commenced. The systems of education that had been established through the Duke's and Violet's commitment to rendering visible what authentic stewardship and what genuine care for the welfare of all might require continued to expand and to deepen. The workers whose welfare had been improved through systematic implementation of principles regarding authentic responsibility continued to experience the benefits of such commitment, and they undertook to extend and to communicate such principles to their own children and to their own communities. The individuals of modest means who had been rendered voice and participation in decisions regarding how their communities were managed and organized undertook to articulate understanding of what genuine stewardship and what authentic responsibility toward all members of the community might require. Yet it was through the manner in which the principle that had been rendered visible through the Duke's and Violet's personal transformation and institutional reconstruction had undergone extension into the very consciousness of those who engaged with such principle, that the ultimate significance of what they had accomplished was rendered most fully visible. For the principle that all individuals possess inherent worth and deserve systematic care and support for their flourishing had ceased to constitute novelty or innovation, and had commenced to constitute matter of such fundamental obviousness and such basic truth as to constitute principle that required no articulation or defense, but rather constituted principle that was systematically woven into the very fabric of how society understood itself and understood what genuine community and what authentic stewardship might require. The moral of the transformation that the Duke and Violet had undergone together and that they had rendered visible to broader society constituted moral of such profound and such universal significance as to extend far beyond the merely historical circumstances of their own lives, and far beyond the merely institutional circumstances of Ravensfield Manor and the region within which such transformation had commenced. The moral constituted articulation that invisibility, regardless of its cause or its origin, constituted matter requiring systematic attention and systematic undertaking to render visible what worth and what dignity might require. The moral constituted articulation that systematic control and systematic maintenance of distance from authentic human connection constituted not strength, but rather systematic imprisonment of one's own consciousness and one's own capacity for genuine meaning and authentic joy. The moral constituted articulation that authentic love and genuine partnership required willingness to undertake vulnerability and willingness to permit oneself to be known by another consciousness in dimensions of such honesty and such depth as to constitute nearly sacred undertaking. The moral constituted articulation that genuine authority and authentic stewardship required not systematic exploitation and systematic maintenance of inequality, but rather systematic recognition that all individuals possessed inherent worth and deserved systematic care and support for their flourishing. Yet most profoundly, the moral constituted articulation that the greatest gifts that any individual might offer to another constituted gifts not of material advantage or of elevated position, but rather constituted gifts of rendering visible what worth and what dignity the other individual possessed, of rendering possible the emergence and articulation of what gifts and what graces the other individual possessed, but had been systematically prevented from manifesting or articulating, of undertaking systematic commitment to care for the welfare and the flourishing of the other individual, not because such care was demanded or expected, but rather because such care constituted articulation of what authentic love and what genuine grace might require. The vision that the Duke and Violet had rendered visible through their personal transformation and through their institutional reconstruction, the vision of society organized upon basis of systematic recognition of human worth and upon commitment to authentic care for the welfare of all, constituted vision that would continue to extend and to deepen, that would continue to generate systematic questioning of how authority was exercised and how responsibility was understood, that would continue to render visible possibility that genuine transformation of society and genuine reconstruction of how community was organized constituted undertaking that was not merely theoretical abstraction, but rather constituted undertaking that was possible and that was already occurring through willingness of individuals to undertake systematic commitment to principles regarding human worth and regarding authentic stewardship. The story of the Duke and Violet constituted story not merely of personal love and personal transformation, but rather constituted story of what genuine strength and what authentic grace might require when undertaken to be rendered manifest in systematic commitment to principles extending far beyond the merely personal and extending into fundamental reconstruction of how society itself understood what genuine authority, what authentic stewardship, and what authentic care for the welfare of all members of the human community might actually constitute. We extend our profound gratitude to you, beloved listener, for permitting us the extraordinary privilege of sharing with you this story of transformation, of grace rendered visible, of invisibility overcome through the power of authentic love and genuine recognition. This narrative has been undertaken in service of the vision that all individuals possess inherent worth and deserve systematic care and support for their flourishing. We invite you to contemplate within your own consciousness and within your own circumstances what principles regarding human worth and what authentic stewardship might require. We invite you to render visible, through your own commitments and your own actions, what genuine grace and what authentic care for the welfare of those within your sphere of influence might constitute. If this story has moved your heart and awakened within you consciousness of what authentic love and what genuine transformation might require, we invite you to render visible such consciousness through systematic engagement with our channel, through subscription, through commentary articulating your own reflections regarding what you have heard, and through sharing with others the vision that has been rendered visible through the Duke's and Violet's journey from invisibility and distance toward recognition and authentic love. Subscribe to Victorian Romance audio stories and join our community of those undertaking to render visible in their own lives and in their own consciousness what principles regarding human worth, authentic stewardship, and genuine grace might require. Comment below articulating your own reflections, your own questions, your own understanding of what this story has rendered visible for you. Share this narrative with those you love, that together we might render visible and render manifest the vision of authentic community and genuine care for the welfare of all.